On this Friday, I am still smiling, and Ben Domenech is here to slice and dice, parse what happened on Tuesday. Good morning, Ben. He is the editor-at-large of The Spectator. He is a Fox News contributor, and I have been reading and watching everything he said and taped. I especially like, Ben, your night video from the streets of New York when you left the Fox headquarters. Kind of gave me my first glimmer that things were going pretty well. Let's start with the big 30,000 view. What happened?
Well, Hugh, I really appreciate it, and yes, that was. I appreciated your comment on that because it was to me an early indication of how things were going. What I was seeing and consistent with something that I'd been saying basically for pretty much the last week. And listeners to your program, one thing I appreciate about accountability and punditry is that because I come on your show every week, because I go on Stuart Varney every week, there is a record of what I have been saying for the last several months. So it's not like I got this, out of nowhere. But I think people were under-indexing the possibility of what happened. Now, I think if you had come out and said everywhere in America, every state in America is going to move right, that he's going to move right in rural areas, he's going to move right in suburban areas, he's going to move right in cities to the degree that they did, I think that a lot of people would have, been very skeptical of you, but that's what happened. And the 30,000-foot view for me, Hugh, is I think this was the buyer's remorse election. I think this was people who went out during the midst of COVID and maybe thought, Joe Biden can be a force for normalcy, have some adults back in the room, be a force against chaos. Schools can reopen, things can get back to normal. I think that they find years later he did not deliver on that promise. Kamala Harris didn't deliver on that promise. Kamala Harris stood for nothing in this election other than being anti-Trump and pro-abortion. And I think that in this context, they went back and they said, you know what? Things actually weren't as bad as the media told us they were. They actually got worse after Trump left, and we'd like to go back to that. And pretty much every demographic across the board went in that direction. The only area where she improved at all was among the wealthy. And that's something that is just an indication of how much this was an overall movement. It's not the story of just like one demographic or one, pick your sort of select polling group. This is everywhere. And the other thing that I do think you can take away from this election, Hugh, and I wonder how this is going to play out in the future. Zoomers, youngest voters among us, especially the young men, have taken a lesson from the COVID experience, and it's not a lesson that Democrats are going to like. And that's that Democrats shut us down. Democrats are about wokeness. Democrats are about things that aren't important to us. They completely hamstrung our college education. They prevented us from getting back to work the way that we wanted to. We're unhappy with the world and the America that they've created for us. And I think that's the kind of thing that's sticky. I think that's the kind of thing that Republicans can appeal to in the future, even when Donald Trump is not at the top of the ticket.
Ben, 3 observations broken through and stuck with me. John Podhortz on Commentary Pod reviewed that liberal authoritarianism is real. We saw it in COVID. We saw it in the attempt to regulate big tech and control speech. We saw it in Andrew Cuomo and vaccine cards at the border. Liberals seized power when the emergency arose, and they liked it. That was number one. Yep. John made me laugh out loud. They liked it. Number 2, Smug on Ruthless yesterday. And Smug yesterday stunned me when he told me that 18 to 25-year-olds went for Trump. No, I don't know by how much, but they went for Trump. Republicans never win 18 to 25-year-olds. And then number 3, Mary Catherine Ham. There is a lot of accountability in this election that was delayed reaction accountability to COVID because of schools and the mess that kids are in. The young moms, and I think maybe dads, you're one of them, voted to protect their children against the administrative state. Not crazy stuff, but they do not want the administrative state and the legacy media brainwashing their children.
You're completely right about that. And on that last point, it was very telling that households with kids under the age of 18 went for Trump. And that to me is an indication of exactly what you're talking about, that the government put themselves between the parents and the children during COVID, and they really haven't let go. They reconsidered the posture that they had toward our kids. and they haven't really let go of that authority in so many different ways. And I think that that's something that people are very much aware of, especially when it comes to the way, that Kamala Harris would talk about some of these issues. The other thing I think, and this is just a fundamental flaw that she had, that I think that, frankly, the legacy media vastly underappreciated as being a problem for her. The radicalism that she exposed in 2019 in her rush to try to get over, the progressive vote within that primary, that ultimately proved to be her undoing in so many different respects. The Democrats basically, they never had an answer on the trans surgeries issue, something like that. Their basically only answer was people don't care about that. Well, I think people do care about that. I think it's an indication of your radicalism and how out of step you are. The only Democrat, by the way, who ran an ad pushing back against that theme was Colin Allred in Texas because it was doing such damage to him. And he got flack from the left for running that ad. And so it was the sort of thing where, even defending yourself on it, saying, well, I'm actually not for, men playing against girls in sports. Even something like that gets flack from your progressive left side. As long as they are beholden to that radicalism, I think that they're going to have a huge problem winning swaths of the country that culturally are traditionalists. They don't think of themselves as ideologically conservative, but they are traditionalists when it comes to these issues. And I think that's something that Democrats of the past appreciated and Democrats of today do not.
Ben Domenech, there's a metric that has not yet been revealed. It's measurable, and I want to know it. Not demographics, not state changes, not county moving towards Trump. I want to know how many minutes did Donald Trump and J.D. Vance spend in an interview setting versus the number of minutes that the vice president and Tim Walz spent in an interview setting. I would bet, I told this to Leland Vittert last night, I would bet that the 3 hours the president-elect spent with Joe Rogan is more than the total number of minutes that Kamala Harris was interviewed by everyone.
I think this is a question for Curtis Hogan and folks over at the Media Research Center. I'm sure that they could probably get that for you. That's a very good number to have. And I think that you're completely right. It's one of the signs that I think, really hurt her this time around. It was this inauthenticity about her that was very apparent toward anyone who paid any attention to what was going on. Everything was produced. Everything was repeated. I'm sure you've seen some of these supercut videos of her doing, the same lines with the same cadences,
yes.
the same
middle-class family.
It's it's weird. It just comes across as very odd. And it turns out that, for all the fact that calling J.D. Vance weird elevated Tim Walz, it turned out he was the weird one. And that's the other thing that I think is really is interesting about this moment for the Democratic Party. They don't have anything to really grab onto. They can point fingers, they can point blame, but the simple fact is you spent $1 billion on this campaign. It's the most ever spent on trying to get somebody elected, and you lost everywhere. You lost with every demo. You moved in the wrong direction everywhere. She's going to end up taking New Jersey probably by roughly the margin that Donald Trump takes Arizona. Think about that for a second. These things are not supposed to be swing states. They're supposed to be easy. And the reason that they aren't is because he, in I think a very smart move near the end, understanding that, the campaign understanding that they were likely to win, they were likely to win the Electoral College. They did some of these expanding the map events that I think ultimately proved to be the difference in terms of him winning the popular vote as well and putting that to rest, which I think should, really be something that we're grateful for in this instance.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Now, that ridiculousness for the next 4 years.
I have to credit one of the minions at Ruthless for this phrase. Governor Walz was deemed by a minion the shotgun Muppet. And I thought that is exactly in 2 words. There are things that stick with you from a campaign. But Ben, I want to talk through the break about this. Sure. I think, put aside the president-elect, he's got 4 years, and J.D. Vance, and put aside Kamala Harris and Tim Walz. I think that the American people value candidates who will sit down and talk to interviews that are not ambushed, that are not intended to ruin you, but just to find out, who are you? And talk to me. You work for me. Yeah. And going forward, it's kind of like the McCain Express from 2000. I think we're going to make that the norm. 1 minute, then we'll break and keep talking. What do you think?
Yeah, I think you're completely right about that. And I think the other thing is that that's where you really get to know the authenticity of the person. The fact that you had this story right near the end of the campaign where they couldn't even make this conversation work with a prominent TikToker because because she couldn't figure out something
Oh,
to say
yes.
that wouldn't offend some demographic or hit some, they ended up just trashing the whole thing because she decided, what's something odd about you? I like anchovies, on pizza or something like that. And it's just, if you have to focus group every decision that you're making along those lines, Americans aren't interested in that anymore. You can't hide from that anymore. You can't, pretend to be something that you're not. And that's what Kamala Harris was doing for so much of this campaign, and it's ultimately why I think Americans said, we don't want to have to listen to this for another 4 years.
So, Ben, let's get started. I don't usually own libs. I don't play a lot of tape of people crying and being hysterical because it's unfortunate that people lose their stuff. Mary Catherine Ham pointed out they ran PSYOP on the American people for 2 weeks. And it got to me. I thought, oh, my gosh, this is going to be a Kamala Harris win. And it wasn't. They were the legacy media was way off, and the pollsters are broken. What do you think about that?
Well, one thing I think is helpful is that we have enough people who are doing polling analysis now that we can look back and look at what they're saying consistently over time. Nate Cohn, for instance, and Nate Silver, the different folks who are writing about this from an analysis perspective. I think it's useful to go back and look at the things that they were saying, the things they were right about, things they were wrong about. They had this as a very close election, and it turned out not to be. But I also think that, you can look at the Real Clear Politics average, and if you took away, if you just made it, just in the final kind of calculus that you called all the states as they were, he won all the swing states. That was written about in the New York Times from a skeptical perspective, but of course it turned out to be the case. And look, this is something that I think they have to continue to work on. And in that final go, I mean, the Seltzer poll in particular, that was infuriating.
That's from Iowa, for the benefit of people who don't know. She was off by 17 points, I think.
Yeah, 17 points. And it's the sort of thing where, there was an argument that happened about that over the course of days. It's like, well, she's a really good pollster. Yeah, but does this really seem accurate to you, given what we know, given all the other data inputs? And of course, it turned out not to be. For the Democrats, one thing that I think in particular that they need to pay attention to is that the legacy media is a problem for them. You recall that piece from years ago by Ross Douthat about the Samantha Bee problem that the Democrats have of being insulated from the ramifications of their extreme opinions because they have such a friendly media around them, because every late night host is going to zhuzh them up and say, oh, you're doing such a great job. By the way, I mean, I hate to say this to my younger colleagues at The Spectator. I say things like, Stephen Colbert used to be funny. Trust me, he was funny at one point in time. He was great on the Dana Carvey show.
I agree. The Colbert show, the first show, was very funny.
But now it's just like, it's pathetic. I mean, it's terrible. And the thing is, that is a problem for them. They need to one of the reasons they need to start talking to these other people is because those folks are not representative. They don't guide the culture anymore the way that they used to. And the fact that Kamala Harris would waste time doing that stupid little SNL bit instead of trying to win is something that I think is an indication of how much that hurt them over the course of the past several years. They were insulated from the ramifications, the actual things that Americans were talking about, and they got it into their head that nobody could possibly be voting for Trump. He's such a racist and a tyrant, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And instead of having a conversation with the American people about that, they just got insulated from it. And so the Democrats need to understand legacy media, as much as we can complain about it, it's their problem. It's a problem for their future if they don't get around it.
When we come back, I'm going to ask Ben about the anger. I think legacy media is angry at the voters. I mean, just genuinely mad at them. And what that tells us about the blue bubble and how do they fix that. Some of them are going to need therapy, Ben. Do you agree?
Some of these podcasts are sponsored by BetterHealth. I think that maybe they need to line up and start dialing in and getting some help.
Okay, we're going to continue that conversation after the break. Stay tuned. Ben, the Youngs don't have a lot of experience with elections, but I want them to know they are going to win, even though they lost. My greatest election was 1980 up until Tuesday night, and then we got waxed in 1982. In 1994, the Republicans won. Bill Clinton won in 1996. I hated 1992. I hated 2008 when we got wiped out. But there's always, the sun comes up tomorrow, whether or not you're a Republican or a Democrat. Donald Trump's not a dictator. He's not a fascist. He's going to leave office. He's termed out. He's done in 4 years. Why the hysteria?
You know, the hysteria is driven by a number of different factors, but I think, it's something you mentioned during the break is that there's a hysteria here because people have a certain frame of how they understand the world that was disabused in this election, and I think that I'm a fan of he's a left center left commentator, Jesse Singal, co-host of Blocked and Reported, and he had a tweet that I thought was particularly apt, which was the frame of the frame to understand the election is this: Donald Trump says something that the media emphatically says will make him lose support among a group. Step two, he gains support among the group, and that's basically what happened in this election. The media kept saying, "Well, you can't possibly like this. I mean, you can't possibly be someone who ignores a joke from Tony Hinchcliffe at MSD. My cousin Francisco, who is a sort of centrist Democrat in Puerto Rico, he actually ran on the Republican governor campaign there, which was successful in Puerto Rico, and congratulations to Jennifer Gonzalez-Colon. And it's one of these things where that is just not an issue. It's not an issue we care about. It's not something that we care about. We expect to be greeted as people who are actually within America as workers, as part of the community, as people who own businesses and who are active, who are parents, et cetera. We don't want to be segmented into these groups as Democrats have for such a long time, basically saying, oh, well, you check this box that says that you're Latino or that says that you're Black, et cetera. Well, that means you automatically should be with us. And that's an assumption that I think has been so locked in for them for so long, particularly in the media, that it has put them in a perspective of being just out of step with the way that Americans think about themselves. Americans do not think of themselves that way.
One thing the left does not account for at all, and I want to make sure I express this carefully because it's a carefully thought out distinction. The Republican Party is a secular organization that takes people of devout religious belief very seriously and the free exercise clause very seriously. As a result, people like me, an evangelical Roman Catholic Presbyterian, I'm bilingual. I'm both Protestant and Catholic. I can talk both and I go to both. People like me are much more comfortable in the Republican Party. That is not to say that there aren't Catholics and Presbyterians in the Democratic Party. They are. But I think the Republican Party has become the protector of the free exercise clause, the secular protector of it, and that's powerfully attractive to Jews and Muslims and Catholics and Protestants and anyone of any faith. What do you think, Ben?
You are dead on. And the number of, look, I have a number of Democrat friends, okay, and I've known them many of them for many years. And one of the things that is true about them is they tend to be, as you might expect, Catholic Democrats. Their parents were Kennedy Democrats. They were Reagan Reagan Democrats during that era. They voted for Bill Clinton. And this is the sort of thing where they, in this moment, so many of them were talking to me in the lead up to this election saying that they were going to vote for Trump or convincing themselves that they needed to vote for Trump because of Kamala Harris's position on a number of issues, but in particular because she, in that NBC interview, stressed that Catholic hospitals would be required to do abortions under her administration. Now, that to me is one of the most extreme statements that any presidential candidate in the history of the country has ever said. It's a complete disrespect of the free exercise of religion, and it's one of the reasons I think that she lost, that is underrated by the media because they don't think about things that way.
And they don't follow Catholics went 21 points, big swing from Joe Biden to Donald Trump. And Donald Trump was on both ballots.
Don't mess with the Al Smith dinner.
We pay attention. Catholics pay attention. And there's Catholic Vote. There are a lot of good groups out there. We pay attention. And we don't want a Catholic state. We are not for the repeal of the Establishment Clause. Christian nationalism doesn't really exist as a major problem. I have one more segment with Ben. So, Ben, I'm 68, and you're, I don't know how young. Well, you're a young man. Okay, you're very young. And I think that my generation had its last election, its last candidate. And your generation.
You brought this up. We didn't talk about this beforehand, but that's actually what I was thinking about writing for Monday.
Well, you're right. I'm happy about that, by the way. plan to retire in 4 years, maybe 8. It depends on how radio and television.
You're not going to be like David Frum. It's not going to pull you back in.
No, I'm not going to stay. I want to see how the Trump story ends, and I want to be around to help the party figure out who to put forward, because I'm a Republican and I care a great deal about that, and I have no opinions. I'm an honest broker. But what do you think is going to happen on the Republican side? Because my generation has got to let go, and they're going to let go. Leader McConnell is the first to let go, and a lot of people are going to let go, and they got to get out of the way, and it's going to happen over the course of 10 years. Who's going to rise up?
You know, we know what happens when you don't do that, which is that you have Nancy Pelosi hanging around deciding who your candidate is by fiat. And so that's not a good thing. And so it's going to be good, I think, for Republicans to avoid that. And you're going to have a couple of people who step up here. You know, we're going to see how this leader race plays out. You know, I see Josh Hawley is backing John Cornyn, my old boss, and John Thune, I think, has a good case to make for himself. Rick Scott's out there. I don't think that he's going to end up being the leader, but he's going to make some points along the way that maybe affect the way the leadership runs. The thing that I think is going to be really interesting is this. You know, you now have a millennial who's about to be the vice president of the United States.
You bet. That's a big deal.
And he's a very but here's the thing, Hugh, and I want to say this carefully. I'm not the biggest J.D. Vance fan in the world. I've interviewed him many times. You know, I'm friendly with him, but I was not someone who was boosting him. But as millennials go, I think he's a very solid, very smart representation of what this next generation of political leadership looks like. And I think that he has the capacity, along with some of the other folks who are around his age, to really understand the country and understand what we've been through over the last 30-plus years from a perspective that can connect with the American people. And that's very important. I think it's important that the next leadership class of the Republican Party be people who are not given a rubber stamp the way that Democrat candidates of that generation are. I think particularly if someone who is contrasted by Democrats intentionally with J.D. Vance, Mayor Pete, who go through this kind of experience where they are just the doors are all opened for them. They get that imprimatur, and they are elevated as being from the very get-go. I think instead it's good to have people who kind of scrap their way forward. And who learn from that experience, who learn from the act of having to communicate. It's still, to me, one of the most interesting aspects of Ronald Reagan was his capacity for communication with the American people came during those GE years, during the Reagan in his own hand radio addresses, et cetera, where he learned to communicate and connect with communities across the country. And I think that that's something that's very important to have as a trait among this new set of leaders that we're going to see emerge, some of whom perhaps might end up in the Trump administration, in the cabinet, or in other roles. I think one role in particular that I think is going to be critical going forward is to see who the once and future president names as UN ambassador. We all know how that's a jumping off point for many careers and how it's elevated some people in the past. They've found a second gear in that role and turned into people who can be real advocates for America on the world stage, and particularly against Russia's and China's interests in a really bold way that helps them understand the world. I think whoever he names to that position, I hope is someone who learns from that experience, because we're going to need a number of people who can speak to the challenges that we face in the world in the coming years, which I expect to be massive.
Ben, I don't know what your schedule is. Do you have any more flex? Can I take you 5-7 more minutes?
Yeah, I can. I can do one more, and that's it.
Okay, great. Because I want to ask you. I want to ask you about the skill set. Not anyone in particular. I have no dog in any hunt. I want to ask you about the skill set, because the Rogan interviews, the Megyn Kelly endorsement, the peanut story that came out of nowhere. These are in a news cycle of 20 seconds. Nimble, ability to think on your feet, and authenticity. I want to hear what you think about that when we come back. For just 5 minutes, I'm going to give you the floor. His time. Ben, last night I was in dinner with the fetching Mrs. Hewitt, and we were walking, and the street music was reeling in the ears. And I said to her, why 50 years later are they using the music from my teenage years as street music, as restaurant music? And why is that? Because everything's changed, and we're fading away. And I want to ask, Barron Trump told his father, go do Theo, go do Joe Rogan. This is important. And nobody won this election except Donald Trump. He had great advisors, but he went out and he found the podcasting world. And I think that should be a big wake-up call to everyone about where they got to go and how they got to talk. We talked about authenticity. Now I want to talk about platform. Don't worry about the Sunday show booking. Talk to Rogan, Megyn Kelly, and people like that. You take off, Ben.
Well, look, I think that what you see from talking to these people and going into these environments is that you see an authenticity from the person because you have so much time to work with. You don't have to work in these artificially compressed segments. You also have a back and forth, a rapport with the person who's interviewing you that is very apparent to the listener. This is long-winded talk radio, essentially, and it's one of the things that I think, I really appreciate it. That's the way that I to associate with or interact with normal people and be normal. And he was always a guy who would go down to his places where they were working on buildings, et cetera, and he could interact with the guys in the hard hats as easily.
We are only 13 months removed from the massacre of 10/7. China is ascendant. They have now a larger navy. John Ellis put it out in his newsletter this morning, largest navy in the world. Russia is doing World War I again in Ukraine. North Koreans are in Ukraine, in Kharkiv. I think the rising generation may not be as aware of the world as my generation was when we rose, because the Cold War was ubiquitous and Time magazine covered it and everyone covered it. Donald Trump will be leaving in 4 years. Do you think he can hold back our enemies long enough for our youngs to develop a sense of the threat that exists in the world that is real and evil? And did it drive part of this election?
I do think that it drove part of this election, but just to your point about holding things back, I think it's not just about us. One of the things that Trump obviously, he was criticized by the legacy media for this kind of thing, but I think it's really important that he get our allies to do more and more as we are doing more ourselves. We need to rebuild our Navy. But, the simple fact is, Hugh, I don't know if you're aware of this. I may have even said it to you before, but you realize the entire British Navy, the entire personnel of it, including the reserves, cannot currently fill the Naval Academy's football stadium in Annapolis. Think about that for a second. This is the Royal Navy that once, bestrode the entire world. We need our allies to be rebuilt too, and we need to help and encourage them and guide them towards doing that, particularly, of course, in the Pacific Rim. And this is something that I think is incredibly important to me. It's important to Mike Gallagher. It's important to a lot of the other people who you care about and listen to. And I think that Donald Trump needs to focus on that in these coming 4 years if we are going to have a hope of preventing the kind of chaos that would result from conflict that would end the kind of just peace that we need in this world in order to have a peaceful future for ourselves and for our children.
I'm going to leave it there, Ben. I think we need back seriousness about the world the same way the music of the 60s and the 70s is still with us. We need the defense attitude of the 60s and the 70s vis-a-vis Xi, and I hope we get it. Ben Domenech, follow him at B Domenech online.